What I've looked at in this project essentially is biosphere reserve governance and the impact of the science policy practice interface. In this particular presentation, I'd like to obviously focus a lot more on the science policy practice aspect, but I do want to start with a little bit of background on biosphere reserves themselves. I think it's a term some may be aware of, but not necessarily a universally accepted term. But biosphere reserves are areas of terrestrial or coastal or marine ecosystems or combinations thereof, which are internationally recognized by UNESCO, and they are essentially these sites that aim to serve as testing grounds for sustainable development. And so within biosphere reserves, essentially these sites are supposed to demonstrate three main components, and that is environmental conservation, promoting socio-ecological and socio-cultural sustainable development, and here, importantly to my discussion, is providing logistic support to research, monitoring, and environmental education. So in contrast to your protected area concept, biosphere reserves function through a zonation pattern. So you'll see here on the slide, this is my study site, the Magaliesberg Biosphere. But you'll see that there are these core areas, and these are core areas where conservation is the main priority. Very little human activity is supposed to occur within these areas. And that is all surrounded by buffer areas. And these are areas of a cooperation where activities should take place, but ideally such that do not negatively affect the conservation component of the core area, and you move out to these transition zones where the focus is really sustainable development and how you can empower people, their livelihoods, and sustainable living in such a way that reconciles the needs of people and the environment. So that's how biosphere reserves function. And what I'm having a look at here, like I mentioned, is governance and the science policy practice interface. So biosphere reserves have these important roles in testing and implementing practices that will ideally lead to ecologically sustainable development. But in order to do that, you require effective governance of biosphere reserves that are supported by strong links between science policy and practice. Something to note about these sites is that UNESCO does not necessarily impose any particular form of governance on them. They are essentially determined. Different countries have different governance approaches, different biosphere reserves, as some of the other students in this project will discuss, also have different governance approaches. And so it's important to see what works for that particular site, as well as how it is linking up into academic institutions and the research that they produce. Governance also of biosphere reserves in South Africa and Africa is understudied. Almost feel like that's a given in a lot of the discussions we have here, because the Global South is in general an understudied region in a lot of fields. But in particular, and that's why my discussion today is on the science policy practice interface, is that although this interface is quite important in the role of biosphere reserves and making sure they reach their full potential, it is globally highly understudied, not just within the South African context, but there is very little information and studies on how research institutions are interacting with biosphere reserves and what the value of that is. So this is just an overview of my entire master's project, but what I am really focusing on here is that second objective, which is examining the interface between researchers and the Magaliesberg Biosphere, specifically with a focus on actions that allow research to be better translated into practice, in particular in regards to the context of the Biosphere Reserve. And what I've done over here is used an embedded single case study, so just taking one case, one area, which is the Magaliesberg Biosphere, and looking at these two different components, which is its governance model, which I'll briefly discuss just for the sake of context, and then the science policy practice interface. How is it that the Magaliesberg Biosphere is interacting with academic institutions and academics, as well as research, and vice versa. And this was done through purposive snowball sampling. So I conducted interviews with the board of directors and management of the Magaliesberg Biosphere to gain their perspective on it, almost from their side of the table. And then there were interviews conducted with academics from the University of Pretoria in particular on certain aspects regarding their research, looking at things like inter-trans and multidisciplinary research, community engagement related research, but also if they had actually done any research or any awareness of biosphere reserves themselves. And that was analyzed through thematic analysis. So just again for this context exercise before I get into the fun stuff, this is how the Magaliesberg Biosphere is structured. It's run as a non-profit organization where there is a board of directors that serves as a decision-making structure and only one full-time employee that forms essentially the entire management body of the biosphere. And some of the key challenges, I think just looking at that structure immediately, is that human resource constraints is likely to be a big challenge, but they also struggle with financial constraints in doing their operations, as well as a poor relationship, particularly with provincial government. There are, however, a number of entities in the landscape that support the Biosphere Reserve, and there's a wide number of stakeholders in the landscape that can be better represented to fully realize the vision of Magaliesberg. So now that I've set that context, that background, what biosphere reserves are, the kind of biosphere reserve we're looking at here, I'd like to just discuss the main point of why I'm here, which is what is this relationship between the Magaliesberg Biosphere and academia? And so in this particular board structure, there are 3 of those 9 board members, or those directors on the board, that actually work as academics. They all happen to work at the same academic institution, which is a good point to now further delve into why is it that this particular academic institution is almost producing a lot of academics who are willing to serve on something like a Biosphere Reserve board. The representation on the board, however, is not linked to their institution. So these 3 members that are sitting in the board as academics are not necessarily sitting in their capacity as academics from such and such university. And these representations have largely resulted out of informal personal relationships. The kind of, oh, I know this person, they would be good on the board, here's some value that they can add, which really emphasizes that importance in bridging that interface. The biosphere, however, has no formal agreements with academic institutions. While they have worked on certain ad hoc projects with universities or academics in particular that they have personal relationships with, there isn't necessarily formal agreements that can guide directions or guide research in a direction between any particular academic institution and the biosphere. And within the biosphere, the kind of research that is happening is largely using the Magaliesberg as a research study site, with a lot of research being conducted in environmental and conservation-based fields, as well as substantial heritage and archaeological research. I know we're in the garden route now, but if anyone is familiar with Magaliesberg, you'll know that the cradle of humankind is also located in that area and forms actually a part of the biosphere, which really does explain the heritage and archaeological aspect. So this is great. This kind of research appears to be mutually beneficial. Academics are exploring their research interests in the area, and the biosphere is also gaining something from that. However, what is a challenge in the way that this research is being conducted is that you see social science research considering the developmental aspect, sustainable development, etc., doesn't really feature in the discussions of what kind of research is happening. So it's still being largely looked at from this conservation perspective without considering sort of the sustainable development and the human component to it within the research. Further to that, like I explained with these sites, the aim is that they should serve as testing grounds for sustainable development. We should be looking and seeing what kind of practices within biosphere reserves can lead to a more sustainable and ecologically sustainable future. But there are, in the case of the Magaliesberg, it doesn't appear to be any studies that are actually looking at the biosphere reserve as a system and as a socio-ecological system, and rather they're largely being used as a study site. So this is where some of the full potential of the biosphere reserve can still be explored. In terms of these research relationships, if you look on the, now my right and left is confusing me, but on the side with the unidirectional relationship, is a lot of the research that's being conducted is driven by academics and their research interests, that the biosphere may then provide support or endorsement to, and they may use some of that research in environmental impact assessments or for information to, kind of like information boards, etc. But it's a largely unidirectional relationship motivated by research interests and not necessarily taking into account what the needs of the biosphere reserve are in terms of the research. And so this is another area where there is unexplored potential in terms of a more bidirectional relationship between the biosphere and academics in terms of producing knowledge that can drive impact and action within the area. So these are some of the potential opportunities in terms of driving that is, like I mentioned, we have academics on the board. They have good links to their academic institutions. There are also a number of personal relationships that can be leveraged, and not that students should be used just as free labor, but student research is often another aspect that can move into areas that an academic or a biosphere reserve practitioner might kind of work between those areas. Another aspect now, looking at it from the side of the academics, is that academic progression incentives usually disincentivize certain kinds of research. And in the case of a biosphere reserve, intertrans and multidisciplinary research and research that is, or community engagement related research, can be valuable tools. This kind of research, however, is not well incentivized because, like my supervisor mentioned, of the concept of publish or perish. You're not necessarily producing the kind of research that takes a longer time, that requires bigger teams, etc. And this is valuable to consider in terms of how can academic institutions from their end be incentivizing research for impact. And finally, just to round up, because I think my time is done, is that there is also a lack of awareness of the biosphere reserve concept amongst academics. And this is a place where, again, we're limiting the degree to which the concept can be utilized. So translating those personal relationships that I mentioned before to more formalized agreements can build greater awareness of the biosphere reserve concept and bring in academics that may have potential research interests but are not necessarily aware of the concept and how it can be utilized. So just to finalize, this is sort of a work in progress, like I've said over there, but this is some of the kind of considerations that we can think about in terms of where the biosphere reserve and academia can build those bridges, looking at the kind of strengths and weaknesses that both have and what kind of, agents and actors we have in between them to build those relationships and bridge the science policy practice divide between biosphere reserves and academia. Thank you very much.